All right, what's up, sons? It's 19 RVR 5786, Wednesday, May 6th. No one really knows for sure Divrei Elohim Chaim, but this is the Mazar we live by. Berkat Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvah v'tzivanu al sefer ha'omer. Blessed are you, Hashem, our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with his commandments and commanded us concerning the counting of the Omer. Today is 35 days, which is 5 weeks of the Omer. May the merciful one restore unto us the service of the Beit HaMikdash in its place, speedily in our days. Amen. Salah! Almost got it, kids. All right. $37.61 creation of the world, birth of Adam and Eve. 36:31 1:30 Seth, son of Adam, was born. 35:26 2:35 Enosh, son of Seth, was born. 34:36 3:25 Kenan, son of Enosh, was born. 33:66 3:95 Mahalal, son of Kenan, was born. 33:01 4:60 Yared, son of Mahalal, was born. We've been doing this bitch 131 days. West side. Really? Oh, for sure, baby. How do you know? Because I just do. Alright, baby.
Always existed in the form that we have it, or that Kabbalah is one thing at all. Of course, neither of these positions is really tenable. Such notions developed greatly through the ages and are still developing. And there are now numerous mutually exclusive schools of Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. this class is meant to serve as an introduction to Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah from the point of view of its incredibly complex development from the prophets of ancient Israel into the rise of modern Hasidism in the 18th century. Of course, this series isn't meant to be exhaustive by any means, but only should serve as a springboard for deeper study and reflection, and hopefully it will also enable you to situate developments in Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah in their historical and cultural context, and hopefully embolden you to dive into the primary texts, which are admittedly as sublime as they are obscure. Let me express my gratitude to Congregation Tzia for allowing me to use these lectures to reach a larger audience here on Esoterica. If you want, you can find the entire series on the playlist Entering the Garden, Introduction to Jewish Mysticism, and uploading them over the next few weeks. Or if you find these episodes after autumn of 2021 and you want to watch the entire series, you can find them in that playlist. Find this series on Kabbalah interesting. I'd hope you check out my other content on topics of esotericism and perhaps consider supporting the production of free academic and scholarly topics in occultism, hermetic philosophy by joining my Patreon or perhaps with a one-time donation. You can find those links below, and I really appreciate your consideration. Now, let's enter the garden of Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. But just as a recap from last time, what we handled was on the syllable Christian Kabbalah and Lurianic Kabbalah. And again, I always look back on how I handled Lurianic Kabbalah, and there's always a problem with teaching it. And the problem with teaching it goes like this: is that either you go too thin or you go too thick. And I always feel like I go too thin, and then sometimes when I feel like I go too thick on Lurianic Kabbalah, I lose people. Even a very thin overview, I think, loses people really rapidly. It's just it requires such a heavy amount of background knowledge in Kabbalah to really get a handle on it. So there's just no right way of covering it without sort of an entire class on it. But the main recap from last time is that by the 15th century, Kabbalah is spreading. It's moving. It's moving not just within the Jewish community, but it's also moving outside the Jewish community. Especially Christians are picking up Kabbalah, the kind of Christian Kabbalah. They're taking Kabbalah from their Jewish neighbors. They're hiring converted Jews to translate text for them, folks like Resius and Flavius and Therides. And so Christian Kabbalah becomes a part of this larger Renaissance movement of trying to mine older traditions for these perennial truths. In that process of mining those older traditions for perennial truths, it's going to build up a philosophy that sometimes is referred to as esotericism or Christian mysticism, specifically in the occult mode. And this form of Christian Kabbalah is going to eventually become a whole thing to itself. The Christians are going to kind of run with Kabbalah, they're going to adopt ideas from it, and eventually what's going to emerge is kind of what is sometimes referred to as the Hermetic Kabbalah, which is a form of Kabbalah that mixes occult ideas and Christian mysticism ideas and Jewish ideas into one synthetic thing. And this becomes the groundwork for what is now called Western esotericism. So, in many ways, Kabbalah gets a life of its own in the Christian world and eventually completely independent of Judaism. Of course, the form of Kabbalah that develops at this time is the Lurianic Kabbalah. And just to go as a refresher back over to what we covered last time, because it's been a couple of weeks because of Yom Kippur in the way. But the big idea in Lurianic Kabbalah is that Luria is going to really focus in on the mythological structure of reality. He's very concerned with how reality comes to be, how it is that God comes to be all of reality. This is a very pantheistic or pantheistic, whatever shade of flavor of that you want to go with. But he's really concerned with the descent of the universe, how the universe comes into being. And he develops, Cordovera helped develop before him, but the idea of the 4 or 5 worlds, depending on how you want to count them. Then you have these various levels of reality. And what ends up happening is that every level of reality, there are more sphirot, more and more Sefirot. If you ever come to the house, I can show you a book I have called the Ilan HaGadol, which is a kind of a map of reality according to the classical Lurianic take, where you have this enormously complicated system of Sefirot within Sefirot within Sefirot. So if you ever come to the house, you want to see this book, I'll pull out the shelf to show you, but it becomes this incredibly Byzantine system of Sefirot within Sefirot, very Baroque, I suppose you could say. But the big ideas, right, are this idea that God retracted some of
One day I'm
God's
going to
self
small fuck's house, we're going to see that.
void, and that divine void is filled with divine light, which shatters vessels inside of it, and this leads to a kind of cosmic tragedy. And that cosmic tragedy is repaired, it's subject to tikkun, and the process of tikkun is accomplished by Jews basically maintaining the Torah, Jews maintaining strict observance to Jewish law, and by that strict observance of Jewish law, the metaphysical realities, various realities are repaired, they undergo tikkun olam, and that paves the way for the Messiah. And so the messianic idea, and this is going to be a big deal tonight, the messianic idea in Kabbalah begins to really heavily alter during the period of Lurianic Kabbalah. And it becomes less the idea that God has picked someone to become the Messiah and is sort of thrown into history as the Messiah, and sort of made Messiah before all time, something like Jesus is. Rather, Messiah is something that you can become, that you can become Messiah by becoming sufficiently righteous and sufficiently metaphysically able to manipulate reality in the interest of this tikkun process. And so we have a lot of ideas of exile and redemption in Lurianic Kabbalah that become very important in just a bit. And so what's going on in Lurianic Kabbalah is a radical renovation and systemization of Kabbalah. Long time, and it's in this 300-year period that the Kabbalah really undergoes its major systemization, and also its major systems theory, and that major systems theory is the one of Itzhak Luria. Now again, I just want to drive this point home. Itzhak Luria did not leave us a system. He left us a bunch of teachings to a bunch of students, and those students don't even agree about exactly what his teachings were. Chaim Vital, the most famous student, leaves us one system. His earlier student, Israel Sarut, pressed these days for whatever reason, but he published another system first that's very different than Chaim Vital. So the question is, what is the real Lurian Kabbalah? The answer to that is, we don't know. We don't know what Luria taught. Luria didn't write much down, and what he did write down, mostly just poetry and stuff. And so we actually don't have Luria's teachings. What we have are his students repeating his teachings many years later. And so how much of that is a game of telephone? That's a good question, and we actually don't know. In fact, even the main body of work that represents Itzhak Luria went on to become Lurianic Kabbalah, a book called Eitz Chaim by Chaim Vital. That book was never even intended for publication. Chaim Vital actually tried to hide it, and it was actually illicitly kind of stolen from him and then published without his consent. And so it's not even clear that that book is even meant to be a systematic representation of Luria's teachings. So it's a mess. It's just a mess. And so often people teach Kabbalah as the definitive Kabbalah. You go to the Kabbalah Center and you learn the Kabbalah. You learn this definitive. That's completely not possible. The Kabbalah is a mess from an academic point of view. And as you study, you realize there are lots of different in the historical record. They don't agree with each other. They don't agree at all. It's a big problem. That's exactly how the Tzimtzum happens. The degree to which when God Tzimtzums, everything come out into the vacuum, is everything pulled out of the void, or stuff left behind? Is stuff left behind? What's left behind? It's just a bit of a mess. Say is I'm going to be talking a little differently than what the slides are saying. So there's going to be a lot more information on the slides than what I say. So that's one thing that will be importantly different about this talk. And the reason why that is there's so much information that I want to get out about chapter 3 and put it in the slides. If I talk about all of it, we would be here all night. So there's a lot more information on the slides than is on that I'll be talking about, but I want to make sure the slides are there. So if you want to read the slides as they go, you'll get a lot more information from there. So that's the main thing to know about it. So if you typically just link to this as a podcast style or something, then you'll be missing a lot of information by not looking at the slides. You do you, as the kids say. So tonight we're going to be talking about a Messiah, a failed Messiah. Judaism is full of failed messiahs. We have lots of failed messiahs. We have Jesus, we have Shabbat Tzvi, we have Shimon, we have Judas, we have a lot of different failed messiahs. The question is, what is Messiah? What is this concept Mashiach? What does it mean to be a Messiah? The idea developed primarily during the Zoroastrian influence period, that is to say during the Persian period, under the sort of reigns of the apocalyptic. And the idea does begin to appear very late in the Tanakh. And it seems to be the idea of a kind of chosen person by God to do some world historical thing. Now, in the Bible, it's not really clear what any of that means. In fact, the only person in the Bible to be referred to as a Messiah is actually a pagan king, King Cyrus. It's a Persian king. It's not even a Jewish guy. So, the idea is that basically God picked Cyrus to do this very idea becomes grounds for the Bible to refer to him as a Messiah. He's the only person referred to as a Messiah in the entire Bible. So if you want to take the Bible for it, the only person referred to is a Persian king. Now, what ends up happening is that over time, this idea of Messiah evolves and changes. And as it evolves and changes, there are a lot of debates among Jews about what it means. And to be clear about this, there's never been a settled notion about what the Messiah is. To this very day, debates about the Messiah go on. It's never been a settled idea in Judaism. Typically what's happened in Judaism, I think I mentioned this in a previous talk, is that people grab onto Messiah, they want a person to be the Messiah, and they kind of backtrack their notion of Messiah onto that person. So you pick a person to be Messiah, and then you figure out what that means, and then you go to the Bible to prove that they are the Messiah. There is no ready-made theory of the Messiah out there. It just doesn't exist. Now, we'll talk about some rough and ready ideas that we find in Judaism, but even they're pretty rough and ready. So, over time, what ends up happening is the notion of Messiah becomes more and more canonical. It becomes more and more mainstream in rabbinical Judaism. And by the Babylonian Talmud, there are discussions about what Messiahs mean. What is it to be? There's no agreement. So, if you read Tractate Sanhedrin toward the very end, 90s of the Dafim, you'll see that there's a lot of debate about even what they thought the Messiah was, what the Messiah could do, what, how you recognize the Messiah, what's the Messiah's name. A lot of debate about this. At any rate, by the Middle Ages, belief in the Messiah had become a dominant part of Judaism. In fact, it's one of Maimonides' 12 articles of faith. You're supposed to believe that the Messiah is going to come. You fervently believe this. This is one of the 12 articles allegedly that makes a Jew, according to Maimonides. So there's the idea that you can believe in Messiah, but it's still not hammered out what exactly Messiah is and what they're going to do. And it's not even clear there's going to be one. There's some messianic texts in Jewish history that even claim that there are going to be two of them. One of them is going to die, and then one of them will be like a military leader. In fact, almost all the literature overwhelmingly is going to be Messiah as a kind of military leader. Furthermore, there's the idea of Mashiach L'Dor, which is the notion that in every generation there is a sort of potential Messiah. That the Messiah is actually out there, and it's just a matter of them activating themselves, or getting activated, or God activates them, or somehow they get activated. And so the idea is the Messiah is out there. They're just a Messiah in potentia, but they have to be made a Messiah in act. It's just that no one has worked at that task up till now. Well, do we know a false Messiah from a real Messiah? Well, the stakes are pretty high, and you can see when I go through this list in a second why Jews don't accept Jesus as the Messiah. Because it's very clear that Jesus has not accomplished any of the things that Messiah, according to even the most general lists. This is true, by the way, not just of Jesus. It's true of every Messiah. Every Messiah has favor. And so some of the list of things that they are supposed to do are things like they have to be born in a Davidic bloodline, they have to be related by blood to David, trace your lineage back to David. They have to rebuild all the ruined cities of Israel. So every city in Israel that's been ruined over history has to be rebuilt. They have to construct a third temple. That's a thing they have to do. They have to be both king and high priest, and they have to live 1,000 years. Well, one of the main problems with Messiah is they tend to die. So, show me one that's lived, above the age of 60. So they tend to die in 1,000 years. They have to bring world peace. In fact, not only bring world peace, they have to bring peace to the point where not even the animals fight each other anymore. So that it's world peace at the level of not even animals fight each other anymore. They have to cause every nation in the world to worship the God of Israel, so everybody becomes kind of Jewish. They resurrect and judge the dead, or at least they judge the dead, which is weird. The Messiah is said to smell and judge. They can know your sins by smell alone. It's sort of like a sin sommelier. They stop all illness. They stop all death. They stop all sadness, hunger, and strife. The kingdom, which stretches from the Mediterranean to the Euphrates, is sometimes referred to as Greater Israel. So they got to do all that. That's the bare minimum. Just to be clear, this is the bare minimum. There are all kinds of other things the Messiah is expected to do. This is just the minimum, right? That they have to do to be a candidate. Now, as you can tell, no person who's ever lived has ever done any one of these things, much less all of them. Now, according to the Christians, Jesus will come back and do all this stuff later, but, well, they've been waiting for 2,000 years, and this guy hasn't showed back up. So, at any rate, these are the sort of general outlines of what we think of when we think of Messiah in Jewish theology. Of course, it's much more complicated than this, but typically, these are the bare bones things that make a Messiah, and the reason why we're still waiting for one. Now, when we go back in time to the 17th century, when we go back in time to the world that's going to produce this false Messiah, Shabbatai Tzvi, there's a couple different things that are going to be important about the historical and cultural context. So I want to go through those really brief. Is that rational philosophy has lost the fight to Kabbalah. Kabbalah has won. There is no more Maimonideanism. Not really. There's not much in the way of rationalistic Judaism. Rationalistic Judaism has kind of gone out the window. And what's increasingly taken over at this point is a turn toward Kabbalah. Now, it's not to say that Kabbalah has spread very far and wide, but it certainly is the dominant intellectual movement at the time. Most of the intellectuals are either going straight into legal stuff via the Talmud, or they are doing that in Kabbalah, but philosophy, for the most part, is just not a big part of the equation anymore. And so in some ways, it may just be an unchecked kind of enthusiasm around Kabbalah. The second thing that makes all this very important is the Alhambra Decree. Of course, the Alhambra Decree was a complete disaster for the Sephardic Jewish world in 1492, where all the Jews were basically ejected from Spain, and eventually ejected from Portugal as well. And this ejection did two things. One, it heightened Messianic expectations. People really thought that this was the end of the world, because it was the end of their world. And the idea was that because it was the end of their world, perhaps God would intervene and save them. But how could all these hundreds of thousands of people be kicked out of their homelands in Spain? God would intervene and fix it. Well, if God didn't fix it, that typically doesn't happen. What ends up happening is that people end up converting. They converted in mass. About the hundreds of thousands that converted to Christianity. And what ended up happening is that they converted to Christianity and then eventually left and began to be Jewish again. Now, what ends up happening in some of these converso communities that's really important is a couple of things that I want to go through relatively briefly here. The first is an intense feeling of exile. They are experiencing anxiety, both they're exiled from their home lives, and they really want to return. And a big part of this is not Jintoria Kabbalah. Kabbalah more generally the exile restoration motif. Secondly, there's just sort of an apocalyptic flair in Europe generally. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. But in the 1600s and the 17th century, apocalypticism, the idea that what was about to end, was just an overwhelming cultural aspect that was going on in Europe at the time, both with Christians and with Jews. One of the things that's also important about this is a shift in converso communities because they were more in contact with Christianity. They've been basically practicing Christianity and learning Christianity for quite some time now, as a generation or two, is that their concept of what a Messiah was much more open to the idea of a spiritual Messiah, or a Messiah that didn't do all the political stuff. Now, the political aspect of the Messiah is essential to the notion of Messiah in Judaism. There's just no such thing as a spiritual Messiah in Judaism. Messiah in Judaism is always a political entity. They're always a king and a high priest. And they always change the world, concrete this world humanity. Well, the Christian idea of Messiah is the Christian idea of open to non-traditional ideas of Messiah more generally. See this in the chapter this week. They were also open to the idea that of what we might call theological supersessionism, which is just to say that having been raised as Christians, they were told the idea that Judaism had been superseded by Christianity. Christianity had come along and corrected all the errors of Judaism, and that Christianity was the superseding, corrected religion, and that Judaism was outmoded. What's important about that is the idea that Judaism in some ways to be replaced. So they're going to convert back to Judaism, they're going to revert back to Judaism, they're going to be much more open to the idea that fundamental things about Judaism can be changed. Traditional Jewish communities would not be open to that idea, but many of these conversion communities and many of these conversion people would be open to it. And also, they're going to be much more open to what we call antinomian tendencies, which is just to say that for a traditional Jewish community, observance of Jewish law, observance of the Sabbath, observance of kashrut, observance of certain aspects of Jewish law are just not questionable. They're not up for grabs. They're not viewed. When living in the Reconstructed world of the 21st century, the traditional Jewish world is very clear. Do not abandon any aspect of Judaism. You can't negotiate it. You have to do it, or it's not up for grabs. But for the Christian communities, there's much more. The law is not immutable. That the law that can be read as a metaphor, or it can be read as a way that can change. That one could alter Jewish law in the interest of spiritual, somehow higher notion. And I this completely informed to traditional Jewish idea very much in the strain of those who have been exposed to Christianity. Further, the situation in Europe is just such that, in general, people expected a kind of apocalypse. That was just in the air in the 17th century. Christians, Jews, Muslims, basically everybody thought the world was about to end in a very, very intense way. Comets started appearing, all kinds of weird stuff was happening. People were really convinced the world was about to end. Further, we also have printing that's taken off. Now, printing is one of these things that disseminates ideas very, very rapidly. And that's one of the great things about printing. You can disseminate ideas very rapidly. You can also disseminate ideas that are incorrect very rapidly. And what you get are all these bizarre broadsheets being printed through Europe that are making claims that are completely crazy. That, what's one example of this? One good example of this is that all the Jews that were the 10 lost tribes of Israel, that they had returned in Saudi Arabia, what is now Saudi Arabia, returned to Arabia, they had amassed tribes of Israel had moved Mecca. They had conquered Islam. This idea is completely nuts. It's not read in any history at all. But they were repeated broadsheets printed through Europe where people really believed the 10 tribes of Europe were literally about to reconquer Israel and bring about into the world. This was a very common idea. So these kind of dissemination of Faulkner's notions were very, very popular. Not just that, but there's all kinds of things going on in Europe that led people to believe the world was about to undergo some big change. Columbus's discovery of the so-called New World. There were the ongoing religious wars of the 100 Years' War, the Protestant Reformation. There's tons of talk about the Antichrist. Everybody was the Antichrist. Protestants thought the Pope was the Antichrist. The Pope thought Martin Luther was the Antichrist. There's the witch trials. there are all kinds of things going on. If you want to get an idea about this time period, right, I'm sure most folks have all heard of Michel de Nostradamus, right? Nostradamus is famous for his quatrains, his prophetic quatrains. He dies in 1566. He's living in sort of roughly this time. So what's going on here is that the entire world is basically expecting a kind of messianic or apocalyptic event. And so, in some ways, had it not been Shabbatai Tzvi, it'd have been somebody else. I really am convinced of that. It just happened to be Shabbatai Tzvi. Also, there's a huge massacre in Poland that kills thousands, tens of thousands, maybe even 100,000. In fact, the Kaminsky pogrom or Kaminsky uprising may have been the largest single killing of Jews prior to the Holocaust, which also occurred in Poland. And there was this massive killing, maybe up to even 100,000 Jews. We're not sure if they died, but it was probably the largest mass killing of Jews until the Holocaust. And also, again, we have this messianic expectation that emerged in the aftermath of this giant massacre. And it's into that situation that we need Shabbatai Tzvi. Shabbatai is born into a mercantile family on Tisha B'Av and on Shabbat. That's why he's called Shabbatai. It's not uncommon it wasn't uncommon then, at least, for names to honor people Shabbat. Now, no one calls it Shabbatai anymore because of how bad Shabbatai Tzvi's reputation has become. But he's also born on Tisha B'Av. You may know this, that on Tisha B'Av, it's a custom in ViralRabbi, which is the Midrash, that the Messiah is going to be born on Tisha B'Av. As you probably know, Tisha B'Av is the saddest day on the Jewish calendar. It's the day of mourning. It's when all these bad things happen. Temples destroyed, and World War I started, and all kinds of bad things. Of course, Al-Qaeda uprising crushed. All kinds of bad things happen on Tisha B'Av. It's a day of mourning. Well, the idea from ViralRabbi is that the Messiah will be born on Tisha B'Av. He will convert the day of mourning into a day of celebration. So already we have Shabbatai being born on just the right day, and not just being born on Tisha B'Av, but also being born on Shabbat. And this is already an auspicious start here in 1626 in Izmir, Turkey. Izmir, as you may know, is the site of ancient Ephesus. So I've been to Izmir. As Kai is growing a little older, he begins to engage in some pretty strange practices already. He's not involved in the mercantile practices of his family. He begins to turn his attention to asceticism, and he begins to drown himself. I was reading the Sefer Zohar and the Sefer Hakanah. The Sefer Hakanah is a book where a student questions a teacher about the various laws, and the teacher tells the student why we do the laws the way that we do. The idea of questioning the law is going to be a big part of Shabbatai's life, as you can see there. Also, it's around this time that Shabbatai, around his teens, that he has this vision or this experience of his penis being damaged by a demon. It's not clear exactly what happened, but sexual issues will plague Shabbatai his entire life. And so the idea that he's being afflicted by the demoness Na'amah, who's a demoness in the Zohar, you may know her better, that's the name of Noah's wife, actually. But this demoness Na'amah, who we find in the Zohar, is said to have done something to Shabbatai's penis and causes him all kinds of problems. And it's around this time in his teenage years, he also begins to experience these periods of what he calls illumination and darkness. These periods of illumination are where he doesn't sleep. He is singing and dancing and he's doing all kinds of strange behaviors. And these will last for several weeks, and then he will be plunged into a period of darkness where he basically won't get out of bed, and he's sure everything is the worst, and everything's terrible. So he's probably suffering. Most psychologists that I've talked to diagnose him after his death, of course, as something like manic depression. But he also, at the same time, he now began to claim that he did supernatural things. In fact, he claimed to levitate in front of several of his friends. His friends said he really didn't levitate, and then he told them that he just didn't deserve to see him because they weren't righteous enough, they weren't pure enough. But he really did levitate, according to Shabbatai. His family tries to fix him by marrying him off, which is the common solution for things back in the day. Just get married and things will get better. Shabbatai refused to consummate either marriage. He basically would not have sex with these women. And these women complained that Shabbatai was basically just studying the Zohar all the time, these illuminations and darkness fits. He wouldn't have sex with them, and his marriages were dissolved. And of course, as you imagine, this is a huge problem for his family. It's a huge embarrassment for his family. But he just refused to have sex with these women for whatever reason. They divorced him. And so he's twice divorced by the summer of 1648. And on June 11th, 1648, he has a vision of Prophet Elijah coming to him and telling him that he is the Messiah, basically anointing and making him into the Messiah, and that he began to exude fragrance from his body. So this is a thing that's commonly talked about Shabbatai's faith, is that he smelled really good. He had this intense fragrance coming off his body constantly. And so he told some of his close friends and his family that he was the Messiah. I don't know how they responded to this. Typically, he kept it pretty secret. In the aftermath of him thinking he was the Messiah, secretly by 1651, Shabbatai is kicked out of Izmir. He is exiled from his homeland. He's kicked out. He's exiled for reasons that aren't terribly clear exactly. But one of the things that we do know that he was doing at this time was that during prayers, he was enunciating the divine name of God during prayer. This is a no-no in Judaism. You're not allowed to say God's name. And Shabbatai was doing this in prayer, along with some other strange things he was up to. And this eventually led to him being kicked out of the community of Izmir. He'll come back. The period that he's roaming around is typically referred to as the years who believe in Shabbatai speak. The period of the years of darkness has him traveling around all through the Mediterranean world. We don't know his exact itinerary, but we know he traveled all around Egypt and the Mediterranean basin, and he did some strange things. He would settle in the really heavily Kabbalistic city of Salonika, and what is now Greece, and there he publicly married a Torah scroll. That also was not a thing you should do. That got him kicked out of Salonika. He seems to have made a pretty strong impression on people as he traveled. Now, making a strong impression is not making a good impression, and so he often made a bad impression on people because they thought he was crazy, or maybe he was a prophet or a Kabbalist or whatever. But he made an impression on people no matter where he went, and eventually he settles in Cairo, where he comes into the family of a very wealthy leader of the Jewish community. And it's there that Shabbatai actually had a job, being basically a fundraiser. What he would do is he would go to Jerusalem and he would raise money for the community there. The community in Jerusalem was notoriously poor. And what he would do is he would go back and forth raising money from local folks trying to get the Jerusalem community back online. Yeah. He was actually on one of these missions of as a pretty famous sex worker, something like a courtesan, but famous sex worker. And when Shabbatai was in Cairo, he actually heard about her reputation, and one of the things that she claimed was that she would marry the Messiah. That was her big claim to fame, is that she would marry the Messiah, and Shabbatai, already having ideas that he was in fact the Messiah, took this as a sign, sent for her. I think she was in Lamora at the time. He sent for her, and she came to Cairo, and he married her in the house of this really famous Jewish leader in Cairo. And he did this probably as part of his messianic buildup, because as you may know, the prophet Hosea also married a sex worker as a sign of his prophecy, that he was acting out his prophecy by marrying this sex worker. And what's interesting is Sarah basically remained loyal to him until she died. She was with him all the way in his marriage, which was like Muslim Saint. She died in 1674, and they were divorced briefly, but they were together for their entire adult life. And so they lived there for about a year until Shabbatai eventually made his way back to Jerusalem. But on the way to Jerusalem, he stops in Gaza. He stops in Gaza because he wants to meet a young and up-and-coming Kabbalist. That young and up-and-coming Kabbalist is a 23-year-old Nathan Benjamin Ben Levi Ashkenaz. Nathan of Gaza is probably one of the leading Kabbalist minds of the time. From his writings, we can see that he understands not just his Kabbalah in general, but he also even understands really higher level debates that are going on inside of Kabbalah. So he even knows that there are specific schools of Lurianic Kabbalah, and Nathan of Gaza is actually wading into the waters of these really technical debates around the nature of Kabbalah as it's being developed. Now, what ends up happening is Nathan of Gaza is also himself not just a mystic, but a kind of prophet, and he's having visions. He begins having visions as a young man, and these visions are such that he becomes kind of a mystical healer. Now, that idea of a mystical healer isn't completely foreign to Judaism. We actually see the same idea, for instance, in Luria. Luria is a physician of the soul, as I sometimes refer to. The idea that Luria and Nathan of Gaza can cure spiritual diseases that you have by diagnosing those spiritual diseases, and you cure a reparation, and that cure will fix your spiritual illness. It will solve your spiritual problems. And so it seems like what ends up happening is the Shabbatai actually travels to Gaza to meet with Nathan, and to basically become cured of his what we might call manic depression, cycles of elimination and darkness. Well, what ends up happening is that he ends up traveling to Gaza. He stays with Nathan for several weeks. And in the several weeks, they go on these very long epic walks. They walk from Gaza to Jerusalem, which is quite a long walk, and they also walk from Jerusalem to Hebron. And it's in those walks that eventually Nathan tells Shabbatai that Shabbatai is the Messiah. He lays it on Shabbatai. He's like, not only can I not cure you, but you don't need to be cured, you're the Messiah. And Shabbatai says, look, I know the Messiah, but I'm not. I gave it up. I knew that I could be the Messiah, but I gave it up. He seems to be in one of his dark periods of this whole business. What ends up happening eventually is that Nathan eventually announces the entire Shabbatai is the Messiah business, and near Shavuot is 1665. And Nathan is possessed by this Magi spirit. This is all incredibly weird. And eventually, what ends up happening is that Shabbatai is experiencing a profound one of these depression periods. And then 3 days later, he declares that he is, in fact, the Messiah. Now, people declaring that people are the Messiah is nothing new. And when are very few who believe them, and they get themselves killed. That's typically what ends up happening. Well, what ends up happening with Shabbatai is absolutely Gaza. He declares he's the Messiah, and he announces that the fast of the 17th Tammuz is to be abolished, and he abolishes it. He does not observe the fast, and rather than observe the fast, he announced Hallel. He said, Hallel is what you say for praise. It's what they in Sukkot for praise. And so rather than engage in the fast of 17th Tammuz, he declares that he has abolished it, that the days of Messiah are here, the days of fasting are over, we can now all celebrate. And he takes, at this point, he has about 40 followers. He takes them from Gaza to Jerusalem, and he declares himself the Messiah in Jerusalem. He says, I am the Messiah. He tries to get on top of the Temple Mount to perform a sacrifice, basically, to try to inaugurate the reality of their temple. He also begins to refer to himself as the Rabbi Rothschild, and The Jerusalem community stops him. They're like, "You're nuts. You're crazy. You cannot go to the Temple Mount. There's a mosque up there. You can go up there where there's a mosque up there, try to kill all in trouble." So the local rabbi goes over to the local Qadi. Qadi is basically the mayor of Jerusalem, the Turkish mayor of Jerusalem. And they turn him over to the Qadi, and they say, "This guy's crazy." The Qadi doesn't arrest him. Not only does he not arrest him, he allows Shabbatai to go around on horseback around the city, waving a green banner. Now, riding around on a horse doesn't seem like a big deal, except for Jews weren't allowed to ride on horses. It was against Islamic law for Jews to ride on horses. It was an exclusive purview of Muslims. But for whatever reason, the Qadi of Jerusalem, probably because he thinks this guy's crazy, lets him ride around, circle around Jerusalem, waving this green banner 7 times, and this is proof for Shabbatai's followers that he's actually important. He's actually the Messiah, because he is able to basically not get arrested by the local Qadi, and he is allowed to circle the city on horseback 7 times, so summoning up some Jericho imagery. Further, he allows his followers to eat forbidden food, certain parts of the animal, which the Bible declares to be unkosher. He says his followers are allowed to do. He allows them to Jewish law, develops even has a special blessing for violating Jewish law on purpose, and eventually the rabbis at Jerusalem send a complaint against Shabbat Empire in Istanbul. Well, it's about Shabbatai is run out of Jerusalem, the Jerusalem community, which previously liked him, at least to some degree. They certainly liked him singing. He was a very good singer and very charismatic. They run him, and what ends up happening, Shabbatai departs for Aleppo, now in Syria. And what happens there is that Nathan's already sent letters ahead of Shabbatai to the folks of Aleppo, specifically letters explaining, using very complex Kabbalistic justifications, things like the treatise of the dragons, other kinds of documents, that Shabbatai is in fact the Messiah, and that they welcome him as the Messiah. Well, it's not clear exactly how and why the folks at Aleppo were so heavily convinced of the letters that Nathan of Gaza wrote, but they were clearly convinced of them because when he arrives in Aleppo, it is a fanfare, ticker-tape parade for Shabbatai Tzvi. He is welcomed into Aleppo with open arms. He's openly declared the Messiah. He stays there for about 3 weeks, and there are people prophesying in the streets that the Messiah has come. He basically converts much of the crowd of Aleppo, most of the community of Aleppo, to him. And he gets perhaps one of his most allies at this time, and that important ally is the son of Chaim Vital. Chaim Vital, his son, Rabbi Chaim Vital is one of the main the main people are responsible for the Messiah or for the Caliph. He's been dead now, but his son in Aleppo, and his son declares that Shabbatai is the Messiah. So it's like having the son of the most important Kabbalist of all time, basically declaring that this guy's the Messiah in Aleppo. It is a huge explosion in enthusiasm that he received in Aleppo. After spending 22 days in Aleppo, Nathan is still back in Gaza, feverishly writing letters, he's writing these tracts, prayer books, and prophecies. He's sending these all over the Jewish world. You could not ask for a better PR man than Nathan of Gaza. And Nathan is sending this stuff everywhere. Everybody's getting it. People are very excited about the things that Shabbatai can do, allegedly. And what ends up happening is that Shabbatai makes his way back home to Izmir. And as soon as he gets there, well, gets what will become the rate of excommunication from Istanbul, and sometime around Hanukkah of that year, there is an explosion of tension. there are the pro-Shabbatite people and the anti-Shabbatite people, and what ends up happening is the anti-Shabbatite guy prayers on the Sabbath, and literally Shabbatai grabs the axe and hacks away all the Sabbath into God. And then chases the other rabbi out of the building, sends it that were inside the synagogue, and sets up kind of a king inside the Portuguese synagogue after chasing the rabbi out with an axe, basically. Not only that, the guy who he chased out, the rabbi who he chased out in his own hometown, that rabbi's daughters fall into prophetic fits, declaring Shabbatai to be Messiah. So this guy's an enemy from all sides. He's being chased around by Shabbatai with an axe, and his own daughters are falling into these enthusiastic trances, declaring that Shabbatai is the Messiah. He does the same thing. He pronounces the divine name. There's all kinds of things that begin to go on. He sings Christian songs in the synagogue. He allows women to come to the Bima to read from the Torah. There are just all kinds of things he begins to do when he's back in here that are rapidly raising the local of the larger Jewish community world. It's around this time also that he kind of makes his marriage with he had not done that yet. The marriage was consummated to great fanfare. It's here at Izmir that they're slowly earning the attention of the wider world. This guy Shabbatai is really packed out in very, very strange ways. For 30th, the end of the year, he sent some of his followers to Istanbul. Now, what's happened by the 30th of December is that in 1666, by early 1666, Nation of God reached everywhere. As far afield as Brazil. People in Brazil have heard about Shabbatai's feet by the time he set sail and by the time he arrives in Istanbul in early 1666. He's famous. He's famous even before he reaches Istanbul. And so everywhere, London, Hamburg, Sana'a in Yemen, Amsterdam, everybody heard about Shabbatai's feet, and everybody increasingly thinks he's the Messiah. By 1666, by the summer of 1666, the estimates range, but the general estimate is about half the world's Jewish population is the Messiah. With some places, like the Amsterdam community, largely converso community, basically having packed their bags and booked boats back to Israel because they were convinced that Shabbatai was literally about to take our world. So that entire community, many people in that community, packed their bags, had them on the dock, and were waiting to go home back to Israel because Shabbatai had done the whole thing. So this was a overwhelming part of the Jewish community. At least half, maybe more. Even Spinoza weighed in about Shabbatai and stuff. Spinoza knew about it. Sadly, we don't have Spinoza's letter, so we don't know exactly what he believed was going on. Well, the trip from to Istanbul should only have taken a couple of weeks, but it took 39 days. They had very, very bad weather, and what ends up happening is that Shabbatai, the view of Shabbatai coming to it's ahead of him. It gets ahead of him in Istanbul. He's arrested. The Turkish government knows what this guy is. They know what he's coming there to do. He's coming there basically to declare his Messiahdom in Istanbul, in the capital of the Ottoman Empire. And the idea, I think, is basically he's going to take over the Ottoman Empire. He's just going to take the whole thing over as the king of everything. He's the king of the Ottoman Empire. So he's arrested, he's either beaten up by one of the guards, and he's thrown in jail. The jail he's thrown into is referred to by Shabbatians as the Migdal Oz, Tower of Strength. And he's put into captivity, but he's put into very luxurious captivity. His followers, which at this point amassed probably in the thousands, are sending enormous amounts of money to him. So that allows him to basically bribe his guards, and he lives he's kind of living like a king inside of this prison, basically. And it's inside this prison that he sees emissaries from it's in this situation in the Migdal Oz that he begins to basically hold court as if he were a king. He's dressed like a king, acts like a king, and he is doing all kinds of things while imprisoned here in the beginning of 1666. Like I said, emissaries from all over. And these emissaries really do believe that despite the fact that he's in prison, it's only a matter of time until he reveals that he really is the Messiah. So he's receiving emissaries from all over, and they are coming back and really preaching the gospel, so to speak, of Shabbatai Tzvi. And it's at this time in 1666 that the Shabbatian movement was at its peak, although it's only been really operating now for about 2 years. What ends up happening is that a hater basically ruins everything for him. This guy named Nehemiah Cohen arrives from Gallipoli, and he's heard about that Shabbatai Tzvi is the Messiah. He meets with him, and basically he becomes disillusioned. He thinks this guy's really not the Messiah. This guy's just a charlatan. He's not really the Messiah. It's probably because Nehemiah Cohen thought he was the Messiah. Enter Messiah beef. And he tells the Sultan, basically, or at least the emissaries of the Sultan, that this guy is a danger. He's living a lot of luxury. He's engaging in all kinds of debaucherous activity. And what ends up happening is that on September 15th, 1660, Shabbatai is arrested, re-arrested. He's drawn. Marchers, and they're going to shoot you with arrows. And if you survive, if you bounce off of you, we'll all convert you. And if not, well, you'll die. And they say, all right, Shabbatai, if you're the Messiah, right, let's do this. And so Shabbatai very promptly says, nope, I'm not the Messiah, I'm just a rabbi. He does not want to be shot with a bunch of arrows. And so the vizier of the Ottoman Empire says, okay, Shabbatai, well, you have one option now. You can convert to Islam or you'll be impaled. Today, you have 5 minutes to decide. You can convert to Islam or you'll be impaled. And Shabbatai, not being stupid, though he might have been crazy, converts. He converts to Islam. He becomes Aziz Amenephim. And he converts on September 16th, 1666. And not only does he convert, the Sultan is actually pretty pleased with the fact that he converted. And he appoints him to a basically ceremonial position as a gatekeeper, basically. And because he becomes a ceremonial gatekeeper, he's actually an official member of the Sultanate court. And he gives him a really nice fur coat, and he has basically the most cushy job ever. His gatekeepers were basically just cushy positions given to members of the court, and Shabbatai could do basically whatever he wanted. So in many ways, he came out, all would have been really bad, or being impaled would have been really bad. But the vizier is out to get this guy. They basically just want him to go away as a problem, and so they give him the cushiest job they can, and basically give him a pension, so that hopefully he will just quit. Well, Messiahs never quit because they're crazy, and because they're crazy and never quit, they're going to get themselves in more and more trouble. And Shabbatai is very lucky that he was not just shot through with arrows. I think had he not had a lot of wealthy friends, I think we'd have had one shish kebab and Messiah on our hands. But he had a lot of wealthy friends, and he doesn't end up with shish kebab. So what ends up happening is that, the first thing that happens is that news of his apostasy spreads all throughout the Jewish world. And this is really bad. This is really bad. Half the Jewish world thought the guy was the Messiah. They had packed their bags. They were already including Shabbatai Tzvi in their prayer time. People were really convinced that this guy was going to basically overtake them, and the world was going to come to an end. They had packed their bags. They were literally on the dock in Amsterdam waiting for news. And the news I got was, oh yeah, he converted to Islam. What? He converted to what? Like, yeah, he apostatized. He's not Jewish. He converted to Islam. So as you can imagine, Not only that, it's incredibly embarrassing. All the Christians just took it as more proof that the Jews were full of it. Completely crazy Jewish people, stupid Jewish people, can't understand anything. And not only that, even the Jews who remained anti-Messiah, but Manasseh in Israel and Amsterdam, they were able to greatly clothe their grasp on the Messianist factions. So this was a disaster, a titanic disaster in the Jewish world. And it was he really is probably one of the greatest intellectual disasters in Jewish history. Nathan wouldn't hear about the apostasy until the summer of 1666, or 1767 actually. He fled to, basically ran over to where he could basically find Shabbatai. And the big debate at this time was, what did the apostasy mean? Now, one thing that you know about messiahs is that when messiahs do terrible things like die or convert to another religion, it's not a problem. It's all part of the plan. That's how delusions go. Delusions are never disproven. Delusions are only reinforced. No matter how ridiculous the delusion is. So, Shabbatai's apostasy was not apostasy. It was part of the plan. It was all part of the plan. Now, what happens here? Nathan of Gaza circulated a letter saying, no, this is part of the plan, don't freak out, don't lose faith. It's very important to maintain faith. So there are actually a couple of different theories that were going around at the time about what really happened. One theory, the craziest theory, is that somehow Shabbatai Tzvi really was now the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. There are some people that continue to believe that. That not only had he not converted, he was just now the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire somehow. Another way is that he had converted, but he converted in order to take power away from the Sultan. So yes, he was a Muslim, but only temporarily because he was about to get power from the Sultan somehow. Who knows how that's supposed to work? The third reason was that he converted as part of a Kabbalistic plan to redeem the deepest, darkest levels of demonic power that was imposed. And the reason why he converted was to descend into the apostasy of Islam, to redeem the Muslims and bring them along as part of a Kabbalistic plan. So his apostasy wasn't really apostasy, it was him sacrificing himself, the suffering servant, by plunging himself into the code. He would be able to somehow engage in a greater act of teaching. The fourth theory about what happened was that he had not really converted, but that the real Shabbatai had actually gone into heaven, and that was left behind was a kind of illusion Shabbatai. So the real Shabbatai is in heaven or somewhere else, going into the supernal realms as part of the grand act of redemption, and that the Shabbatai that he converted was a kind of illusion or a kind of or something. So it really wasn't Shabbatai. So these are the big four theories that circulated about what happened when Shabbatai converted to Islam. It seems like Nathan of Gaza accepted some version of 3 and 4. He accepted some version of 3 and 4, more 3 than 4, but certainly accepted 3. And his position was, yes, the Shabbatai converted to Islam, but this was a temporary thing. That he would eventually redeem Islam, redeem the Muslims, and that he would emerge out of Islam back to Judaism, and he would emerge as having redeemed this fallen religion. Shabbatai, for what it's worth, basically fell into a titanic depression, as you can imagine. I mean, he basically just became apostate, he fell into a deep depression. In fact, he said, I'm done. I'm done. He just plunged himself. He plunged a really, really deep depression. Nathan of Gaza never gave up. In fact, in the end, he never gave it up. And not only does the Shabbatian movement not die, the 1666 version, but it seems like Nathan of Gaza's reworking of the myth actually caused it to flourish. It calcified the religion. Okay, so what I'll do is jump back on to the share. Right. So what I'm going to do is, what I'm going to do tonight, I'm going to finish up that speed, and then we'll do Nathan of Gaza, and we'll do the Frankus next time, because it gets even crazier than Chapter 3. If you can believe that. It's going to get even more crazy than Chapter 3. So we'll finish Chapter 3 tonight, we'll do the Frankists next time, and that'll also give us a transition perhaps into Hasidism, which I'm sure my Hasidic people will absolutely hate, but they are connected. At any rate, Shabtai Tzvi converted to Islam. He has a son, Ishmael Mordechai, which is a fantastically Jewish Muslim name. Ishmael's an Islamic name, Mordechai is a Jewish name. And what ends up happening is that Shabtai began to continue to live as the gatekeeper of this ceremonial position. He lives a kind of mixed life. Quasi-Jewish. And so over time, it seems like Shabbatai Tzvi also begins to believe this as well. And again, Shabbatai often suffers from these deep depressions. It's not clear what he believes at any given moment, but it seems like Shabbatai does come around with the idea of the Messiah. Now, the Muslim leadership of the Ottoman Empire gets word of this. They don't like the idea that he released as a Jew. What ends up happening is that the rabbis of Istanbul, the chief rabbis of Istanbul, are exhausted with Shabbatai to basically hold court as a kind of time. And on September 1672, they go. I mean, basically tell the Pasha that's not really, he's Muslim, and not just that, but he's doing all kinds of blasphemy. This charge is taken very seriously by the 1673 exile to now Montenegro. Basically, he's exiled to get away from all the Jews. They're kicking the Pasha anywhere. They don't have the most obscure, one of the most inaccessible regions of the Ottoman Empire, basically, to get him away from the Jewish world, the Jewish community. And it's there in exile, and even further exile. His wife Sarah would die, take a Pasha, and he would die alone. Wrong. At any rate, on September 17th, September of 1776, he dies during the Hila of Yom Kippur. He dies as the gates are closed. And his last Jewish act as Messiah, I suppose, was to request a Machzor, a Yom Kippur prayer book, so that he could say the prayers of Yom Kippur. And we're told that Tzvi, or Amira, Aziz Method, actually prayed and doing prayers as he died on near Elam. He was intentionally buried somewhere that no one could find him. The legend is that he was buried in a cave near the sea, and when his brother had come to visit him, there was a dragon actually guarding the mouth of the cave, and that when they came back to the cave, the dragon was gone, the cave was full of light, and Shabbatai's body was nowhere to be found. Very much like the story. The ancient Shabbatai's feet ascended to heaven, or at least gone into occultation, and no one knows to this day, by the way, where Shabbatai's feet is buried. This is not clear at all what happened to his body. Was his body vanishing? It only adds to the idea that somehow he is hiding the resurrection. Nathan of Gaza is a cigar guy. Continued to believe that Shabbatai was the Messiah all the way up to his death on January 11th, 1680. many years after Shabbatai died, he continued to write pro-Shabbatian tracts all the way to the end. He said that Shabbatai wasn't dead, that he was in, that he had been ascended into heaven, transfigured somehow. And he died eventually in Skopje, in Macedonia. He's trying to live closer to Shabbatai Tzvi. And his grave actually until his exploded during the Second World War was an object of veneration. Shabbatians continued to flock to his grave. Now, you would think with Shabbatai dead and with Nathan of Gaza dead, that entire movement, as bizarre as it is, would just peter out with both of these guys. 1680 would be the end of the Shabbatian movement. Well, if you thought that, you'd be dead wrong. Because Shabbatianism is about to explode from a few hundred, maybe a couple thousand people, tens of thousands of people, to form a completely new religion. Shabbatianism is going to form a totally new religion. And that's really what new religion is going to be primarily Shabbat, or Yocheved. So, when we'll get to it next time, we're probably in a section on Shabbatianism. There were Shabbatians after the 1880s that survived in this Shabbatian world. We think that maybe the Holocaust actually killed the last of the Shabbatians. We don't know for sure. Part of what is true about them is they don't tell people about it. It's part of their religion to hide their religion. And so Shabbatai Tzvi, the Shabbatian movement, is going to continue to function, and the Shabbatians will continue to function in Turkey as a group called the Donne, all the way up until maybe even now. There may still be Shabbatians in Turkey right now. That religion might still be alive. The issue is we don't know. Most scholars think that it's extinct. But I will tell you that I taught a class on Shabbatai Tzvi, an 8-part class on Shabbatai Tzvi, and one of the people that took the class was a Turkish woman. And she took the class at the Federation. She took it because she came from a Shabbatian family. And she said that her family, her grandfather, had continued belief as a Shabbatian, but that his parents didn't. Her parents didn't, and she didn't. But she knew that she came from a family that believed in Shabbatai Tzvi. That was part of their family history. And I asked her, are they Shabbatians left in Turkey? And she said that she had not met anyone, that she knew of families that were Shabbatian families, but she didn't know of anyone practicing Shabbatianism any longer. So many scholars think that it's gone extinct, but it's up in the air. Again, part of how the religion operates is by keeping it secret. So next week what we'll do is we'll talk about the second part of all this. How a basically manic depressive Messiah who died, who converted to another religion and died, managed to give rise to a completely new religion. And that religion, Shabbatianism, actually survived, and may even survive up to this day. So we'll talk about that branch off of Kabbalah and how this Kabbalistic stuff led to the Shabbatai Tzvi movement. And if you've ever heard these rules around you can't study Kabbalah until you're 40 and married, etc., etc., if you've ever heard those rules only emerged after this whole Shabbatai Tzvi. Because how much of a disaster this was in Jewish history. So the Shabbatian moment has those rules. It's actually wants to pump the brakes on the spread of Kabbalah, because up to this point, Kabbalah was spreading very rapidly, very publicly. After the Shabbatai Tzvi episode, the rabbis are going to pump the brakes, because they're going to say, oh, it's Kabbalah stuff, it's very dangerous, it's a whole disaster. They're going to pump the brakes on it, and it's going to slow the spread of Kabbalah in some ways, and it's going to give rise to a whole new religion. The religion of the Donne, the religion of continued belief in the messiahship of Shabbatai. So, wrap up Shabbatai. Welcome back, and thank you for joining me as I explore the garden that is Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. Again, if you'd like to support my work, I'm providing accessible, free, and scholarly content on topics like Kabbalah, alchemy, and occult, magic, and philosophy. Consider supporting my work on Patreon or perhaps with a one-time donation. You can find those below. Until next time, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.
She was dedicated to the whole week, which numbers now probably in the 15,000 people that watch the share a day. It has tremendous stuff. It's actually growing at a quicker rate than people share. It's very popular in so long. That was popular sheets over there, whereas in America, it is popular. They don't tell you about it. And then someone come over to me. What's your business? What's my life? I watch the share every day. Like that room t-shirt. I don't know what it is. Okay. Interesting, oh, you can down to the next one. Yeah, it was awesome. So, that's what I have to say to that. Maybe once in a while we'll say the memory of or for us, but the amount of soldiers that are injured even now, you hear about deaths, you don't hear about injuries. What you do hear, you don't realize that injury means you're out of control. You went to these guys who come to Chicago, some of them, no arms, no legs, aesthetic expert. And you went to visit them. A lot of amputees. These are injuries that are life-changing injuries. So, of course, we doubt we hope that to see the enemy go back. Things are happening. There's a lot of stuff here.